Hello, everybody. I'm Adam Kelnhofer here with a DC Wrap feature for you on ranked choice voting and Final Five voting. I'm joined by Sara Eskrich from Democracy Found to talk about some of the upsides and downsides and general format varieties of ranked choice voting and Final Five voting. So, Ms. Eskrich, can you talk to us a little bit about, first, let's talk about some of the downsides. What are some of the issues that people are having with ranked choice voting and Final Five voting?
Sure. So a key distinction just to make from the get-go is that ranked choice voting is a methodology for running elections. So it's a way in which you vote. So people have very different experiences with using it because it's new. And mostly ranked choice voting has been used at the local level in municipal elections. And typically, as we know in Wisconsin, those are nonpartisan elections. So some of the criticisms that you hear sometimes about ranked choice voting is that it voter confusion, because basically what it means is you have all the candidates on one ballot and you have the opportunity as a voter to go through and rank your choices to say who you like the best, second, third, fourth, fifth, and all the way through, however many candidates are on that ballot. So early on, when some municipal jurisdictions implemented ranked choice voting, there were, it was new and people had a little bit of, they had to learn how to use this new system. But what they found was that it actually wasn't very hard for voters. Voters were very capable of going through and ranking their choices on their ballots, even when they had many candidates. So the examples that again get used in criticism are when in certain elections, take one in Minneapolis, there were 35 candidates for mayor on the ballot. Well, that's a lot of candidates to ask voters to evaluate and then rank fully. So the distinction is that Final Five voting is a different system for a different set of elections, really aimed only at federal elections, and narrows the ranking opportunity to only 5 candidates in the general election. So we overcome some of those challenges around voter confusion because you're narrowing the slate of candidates through the primary process, the top 5 primary. And we can go into more details about how the two systems work if that's helpful. But I think that when you ask about criticisms or downsides, the number one thing we hear is that it's too confusing for voters. And that just hasn't really been the case in practice.
I see. Yeah, but going away from some of the opponents of ranked choice voting in Final Five, we know that U.S. Representative Mike Gallagher is a supporter of, I believe, Final Five voting specifically, which is, a system that I believe Democracy Found has or is supporting bills that would create Final Five voting in congressional elections in Wisconsin. So can you talk about how that Final Five voting system would work?
Sure. So Final Five is all about really interrupting this cycle of gridlock and dysfunction in Washington, D.C. So as your readers will know more than others because they're paying attention to Washington, D.C., there's not a lot that happens in D.C. And when things happen, it tends to happen in a partisan way, even things that should be done in a bipartisan way, things that could happen because the majority of the country agrees that there are solutions to some of our really complicated problems. And yet we don't see any progress on those problems, in part because of, we believe at Democracy Found, the electoral system itself. So Final Five is about looking at where these root cause challenges are with the lack of results out of Washington, D.C., and interrupting that and changing those underlying incentives for elected officials to get things done. So the easiest way to think about it is something that we all kind of know, but we don't really think about very often, which is to say the primary election in our current electoral system, particularly for Congress, is really the only election that matters. In fact, recent data just came out from one of our partners at Unite America that showed that essentially, even in 2020, when we had one of the most, the highest turnout elections we've had in recent history, it was essentially 10% of the population that elected 80% of our members of Congress, because that's who voted in the primary, and those districts were uncompetitive in the general election. So what that does is it makes it so that our members of Congress are essentially only accountable electorally to a very, very small segment of the population. So Final Five voting interrupts that by shifting the electoral competition from the primary to the general election, because it makes it so that we don't have party primaries anymore. So instead, you go into your primary election as a voter, and you don't have to pick whether you're going to vote in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary. You see all the candidates on one ballot, and you vote for your favorite. And then the top 5 vote getters in that primary advance to the general election. And that's where this system of instant runoffs comes into place. So you have the opportunity, using a ranked choice ballot in that general election, to signify your preference of those 5 candidates, to say, if you just want to vote for your favorite, you can do that. No problem. Your ballot counts just like it does today. But if you also want to tell me who you think you would take, if you can't have your favorite, who's your second favorite, and then maybe even your third, you have the opportunity to show that preference. And in a ranked choice general election, you count all those first place votes first. And if someone gets over 50%, the election's over and that person wins because they've got true majority support. But if no one wins with first place votes alone, you go into this series of essentially runoff elections that happen instantaneously. So that's why it's easily described as an instant runoff general election. You drop the candidate who comes in last and they have their second choice votes counted. So that process essentially enables us to get to candidates who are elected by the broadest majority of their constituency. So that is really important when you think about the incentives when you're in DC governing as an elected official and who you are serving, because now you're serving your general electorate, you're serving your whole constituency, because it matters if you have majority support. It matters if you get first, second, maybe even third place votes from your constituents and you do a really good job governing. Because if you don't do a good job on behalf of your constituents, there's a real threat of potential competition that just doesn't exist in our system as it works today. So that competition piece of Final Five voting is such an important, I believe, rationale for why we've gotten the support that we have for Final Five voting amongst Republicans, Democrats, civic and community leaders, people really all across the state of Wisconsin who have been able to come together, even if they don't agree, typically on candidates or policy solutions. They can agree that systemically our electoral system is not doing the job that it should be doing, and that this is a true innovation that could interrupt those misaligned incentives and help get us better results out of Washington, D.C.
Yeah. So we've definitely seen a lot more focus on like ranked choice voting and Final Five voting for sure. But so it's interesting that you talk about how this might pit candidates up against each other a little bit differently than our current election system. Are there any past elections that you can talk about where you could see maybe ranked choice voting or Final Five voting would have changed the outcome that we saw?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked the question, Adam, in that way, because it's really important for me to articulate, as our co-chair at Democracy Found does all the time, Catherine Galloway says, Final Five voting is really not about changing who gets elected. It's about changing the incentives for what that elected official is incentivized to do when governing. So if you think about it, this system is not going to change a blue district red or a red district blue. It's not. It's just going to elect the person that the majority of the constituents in that district think represents them. So if the majority of them are Democrats, they're going to elect a Democrat. If the majority of them are Republicans, they're going to elect a Republican. But they're going to be elected by that general electorate, not just the less than 20% of the electorate who vote in partisan primaries. So that's really important. And that's a really important distinction that makes it really hard to look at past elections, because there have not been any elections that have been run through a system of Final Five voting. The first state to implement or to work to implement this combination of opening up the primary and then using instant runoffs in the general election is Alaska. They passed it by ballot initiative in 2020, so it will be in place for their 2022 elections. So you can think about Alaska, and I think in some ways, unsurprisingly, Alaska is a pretty independent state generally. You have a senator in Alaska who's been elected by a write-in process and is now up for re-election. You know, Senator Murkowski is going to be on the ballot in 2022, and she no longer faces a Republican primary. She has this open primary and then this ability in the general election to appeal to the majority of Alaskans and do what the majority of Alaskans want her to do while governing. So that's really, I believe, freeing as an elected official, because if you got into public service because you want to deliver results for your constituents, what better way to do that? So that's what I would say in terms of, you know, how can we look at past election results? We can think proactively and think about what might happen differently in Alaska in 2022. And just because you brought it up, let me share, there are other states like Washington State and California that have done part of this change, and even the state of Maine that have done part of this change. So California and Washington State and Nebraska, actually, for their state elections, have a top 2 primary system. So they don't have party primaries. They've got this open primary, but only 2 candidates advance to the general election, which we've seen just doesn't create that same degree of healthy competition in the general election that's so important to the results we're interested in, which is accountability for delivering results in Washington, D.C. And then the state of Maine has implemented ranked choice voting specifically for their federal and state elections. So to say, they didn't change their primary process, they're simply using ranked choice voting as a tool in their primaries as they're currently constructed and in their general elections. So it's not quite analogous, but there are these various experimentations going on with how we vote, because it's a federalist system and we as states have the ability to innovate on our electoral system. That's how our Constitution designed and delegated powers to states to run our elections.
Perfect. So we've talked about the varieties of ranked choice voting across the country. What are some of the proposals in Wisconsin? We know Democracy Found is advocating for Final Five voting. Do you want to talk about why Final Five voting over maybe other formats?
Yeah. So there are a couple bills that have been introduced in the state legislature, one specifically for ranked choice voting, and then the bill that we're supporting, which is for Final Five voting for federal elections. Now, obviously, there's a piece of this. These are somewhat related, but clear difference in terms of the outcomes that we want out of this system. So ranked choice voting alone can be a really good tool to increase representation and make sure that whoever is elected by the majority. So a lot about often thought about as about representation. Final Five voting is really about results. And it's really about how do we make sure that by interrupting that partisan primary system, we allow the power of healthy competition to create accountability and allow voters to have real choice and allow voters to make sure that whoever represents them has the broadest support from their electorate, and that elected official is, as I said earlier, really freed up to govern in the best interest of all of their constituents. So there's something about Final Five voting that is really specific to delivering outcomes. And we believe it's really important to start in Washington, D.C., where Congress's approval rating never gets above 20%. People are really dissatisfied with the way that Congress is doing their job right now. So let's clean up that mess. And as our state legislative sponsors for Final Five voting have really articulately said, Senator Kuyenga and Representative Reamer wrote in an editorial that, I'll paraphrase, something like, this is their job to fix Washington. You know, we can't just complain about the dysfunction in Washington, D.C., when as elected officials at the state level, we have the ability to change it. That therefore gives us the responsibility responsibility to do something differently. So really proud to be working with elected officials like those two leaders in our state and their colleagues who are willing to start the conversation about how we can do things differently to get different results out of Washington, D.C. with Final Five voting.
Perfect. Well, yeah, as we know, states have the ability to run elections only. That is in the Constitution. But yeah, it was great to have you on today. It was wonderful to talk to you, and thank you so much for joining me on DC Wrap. And thank you all for tuning in. I hope you tune in next week for another edition. Thanks.
Thanks, Adam.